This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with artist Barry Exball. His work utilizes the latest advances in 3D imaging, stone cutting, and robotic milling to create breathtaking sculptures that are in conversation with art history. The hand-finished sculptures are known for their use of unique varieties of stone from around the world, as well as their meticulous craftsmanship. The results are captivating. And now, a conversation about 21st century stone sculpture with Barry Exball. Barry Exball, thank you so much for joining me today on the Art Sense podcast. Barry, I usually like to start with artists with a hypothetical, which is, say you're seated at a dinner party next to someone who doesn't know you and has never seen your work. How do you describe your work and what it looks like to them?
My work is purposely complex, so it would take me a few minutes to describe it, but to try to cut that down, I'm probably the contemporary artist in the international milieu who has most consistently produced stone sculptures, an ancient endeavor for the longest time. For the past over 20 years, my work is recognizable figurative stone sculpture. Beyond that, its relationship to work of the past is indirect and complex.
You know, I was having a conversation with an artist recently about how a lot of the magic in art making is in unexpected chance. Starting one place and then through working in the studio, through happenstance, through serendipity, the next thing you know, you've kind of come upon something that really resonates. And I thought that might be an interesting conversation to have with you because you haven't always been the Barry Exball we think of today. You're originally from California, you get to New York, and your work looks different when you arrive in New York. Can you kind of describe where you were when you stepped foot at JFK?
Well, actually, I drove cross-country in a VW bus.
That's so much more romantic than getting off a plane.
Yeah. It turns out that my side job to support myself as an artist was me delivering parts between JFK, Newark, and LaGuardia Airport. So I did spend a lot of time at the airport. But I spent a month coming across country, visited all the museums and, knew this is where I should be and had been told that by my professors in college. They knew I was serious and pretty compulsive and dedicated by nature. And at that time, Los Angeles was a far number two to New York in the United States as a place for artists to live and settle. I mean, there's a couple shows going on right now about LA art in the 60s. And, there was another reason why I left, and it was to get away from a complicated family situation and never looked back. And so I was lucky to have met when I first arrived a group of artists who were also super serious about what they did, but they were coming out of minimalism. And a lot of them were monochrome painters, and the kind of religious fervor that they had for art making matched one thing from my background, was that I was raised by intense fundamentalist Christians. I had abandoned that and basically substituted art for Christianity when I met it in college. But I met amongst this group of painters in New York a kind of rules-based practice. I subsequently rejected that too, although I respect what they taught me. There was a period in New York when there were not nearly as many galleries. We're talking late 70s, early 80s. The art community was smaller, and almost all of these artists were 10 to 30 years older than me, had been in New York for many years and did not have art careers, but painted all the time. Now, that's a phenomenon we don't really have anymore. You come to New York and either you got to get an art career going or you kind of take off and leave. And these people were going to be here hell or high water and make their art, and they spent a huge amount of time doing it and all had side jobs. And that was the model that I drank in. I thought I was never going to have an art career either. Concept of selling art, showing in galleries, all of that was kind of foreign. These people were more about studio practice and then dialogue around it. I mean, we're talking sitting around a long table with 15 and 20 people recording their dialogues and arguing civilly but intensely about the aesthetics of what they're doing. I just really don't think you have that anymore. And it was a great kind of fundamentalist way for me to, again, start thinking about my work. And anyway, so my work reflected that initially too.
One of the guests I had recently on the podcast was Donald Sultan. And in some of your earlier panels, it kind of remind me of work he was doing and work he still does, where he uses plywood to construct these platforms that come 2 to 3 inches off the wall. And then he uses a grid of materials to start working on. And I see some of that in these original panels. Can you kind of talk about how you went from something that was flat, at the very most considered a relief, to starting to explore 3 dimensions?
Sure. Well, I, for the first time, really saw in depth historical works here in New York. The Metropolitan was my favorite museum. I went there many times more than the modern art museums, the Modern, the Guggenheim, and the Whitney, and started to fall in love with the directness of Italian gold ground panel painting, Quattrocento, Trecento, Giotto, Duccio, etc. And then started to explore the materials that the artists at that time utilized. Read Cennino d'Andrea Cennini's famous treatise on making paintings, and also read Ralph Mayer's, art technical book that everybody read about working directly, creating your own materials, don't use adulterated commercial materials, etc. And then started to think about the support that I painted on. I mean, this is a kind of a confluence of my kind of fascination with this ancient work and the thinking that goes into minimalism, how an object relates to the room it's in, how it's attached to a wall, pedestals, revealing everything, stripping away all that is superfluous, etc. One of the monochrome painters, always likened his paintings to racing sailboats, and he said that everybody else was making cargo liners carrying cultural cargo. I'm making stripped down racing vessels. Okay, I've come a long way from that kind of absolutist stance, but that was the thinking that was current at that time. Really getting beyond the modernist initial breakthroughs and getting pretty religious. Donald Judd, Robert Ryman, Bryce Marden were admired artists. Richard Serra and so on. For me and this group of people I was with, And eventually, even when I moved beyond being involved with this monochrome group, I loved that approach. And I've often said that if you look at what I'm doing today, if it's a flayed riff on St. Bartholomew, uh, it has the same thinking as my works that were monochrome rectangles on a wall. And I think a lot of people confuse minimalist thinking with boxes, spheres, cones, circles, reductive forms. And to me, it was more a comprehensive, minute way of thinking about an object and all the elements that go into it and how it's presented. And it could actually take a figurative form, but still have that same rigor of thought. And I think I've kept that. That's at the core of my art making, even though the form is radically different than what I did and made 30 and 40 years ago here in New York.
When you departed this monochrome group, is that when you started experimenting with the black and white cut Korean pieces?
Yeah. That was a kind of if you want to look back retrospectively, you sound like an art historian, not
Well, I
me,
try.
but
I
I
don't.
do. But, there's a transitional phase. I suppose that's it. I started being, again, just seductively interested in Italian uh, striped Gothic architecture, Siena Cathedral, San Miniato al Monte in Florence, the buildings in Pistoia. I just somehow loved that. I related to striped paintings that I was seeing that were, more contemporary, and started making the units of my support, the width of the stripes, equal to the size of the squares of gold. I mean, everything had to make logical sense, but they became steadily more complex. This work with the support led me to teach myself to be a woodworker. I should say that, I went to a liberal arts college, Pomona College, Claremont, California. It was the only non-religious school I'd applied to. I was having severe doubts about my whole fundamentalist background, and when it came time to accept admission, it was my only choice. And the rest of them were like Biola and Westmont and all these other Bible colleges. And, thank God I met art and all of the disciplines that I'd been sheltered from growing up. And, look, here I am. But in terms of my work, it comes out of Catholicism. You'd have to say all of those gold ground paintings I'm looking at were depictions of religious scenes. But I was focusing more on the object, and I taught myself to be a woodworker. I picked up all the technical skills that they didn't have time for in a liberal arts college. I remember asking a professor, I went with a long list of how do you do this, where do you find that, how do you buy this, how do you make this? And he says, Barry, we don't have time to talk about that here. We talk about ideas. It was probably a pretty good thing, because they would have taught me ceramics or clay modeling or oil painting. I mean, I did a little bit of all those things, but, I ended up having this really high-tech slash old school working method that they wouldn't have taught me anyway. And so I went about learning how to make things in New York in a very dedicated way. I had respect for New York and the artists who were here. I felt like this was the Olympics, and you don't go there unless you've been training for years to be able to make things well. And so that in that process of learning to make things, it just amplified my desire to make the support of the painting part of the painting. And then the next step was to have it come off the wall and start to be a sculpture per se.